The lights in the studio were unusually intense that morning. Not just bright, but sharp, like they were trying to slice through tension before it even arrived. The guest list had been teased all week. Candace Owens would be returning for a special segment, and in a surprise twist, Denzel Washington had agreed to sit opposite her, not for a debate, but a conversation. At least, that's what the producers called it. Behind the curtain, Denzel sat calm. Tailored charcoal suit, no tie, crisp white shirt. His demeanor, as always, was composed, like a man used to walking into rooms meant to unnerve him. A producer whispered something in his ear. He nodded once. No nerves, no fidgeting. Just stillness. Across the set, Candace Owens adjusted her mic-black blazer, piercing stare, the kind of confidence sharpened by years of combat in the media trenches. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. This wasn't her first time going toe-to-toe with someone America admired. But this was different. This was Denzel. The show opened with a thunderous theme and quick montage cuts. The host welcomed viewers, teased an explosive dialogue ahead, and then motioned for the cameras to pan wide. Denzel and Candace were already seated, just 6 feet apart but worlds apart in tone. Let's get real, the host began. Race, politics, and media. Where are we headed? Candace leaned in, her voice quick and rehearsed. We're headed toward a society that punishes truth and rewards victimhood, she said. And frankly, people like Mr. Washington have helped normalize that. Denzel didn't flinch. He just turned his eyes to her, steady. People like me, he said slowly. Candace didn't back down. Yes. Actors who get praised for talking politics they don't understand, who use their fame to push narratives that divide us. The host went quiet. The room tightened. The audience leaned forward. Denzel let the silence hold. Then, you think using your voice is division? He asked, softly. I think using your pain to gain applause is manipulation, Candace shot back. That was the spark. But Denzel? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't cut her off. He just smiled slightly and replied, you mistake survival for performance. That says more about your comfort than my truth. The audience didn't clap. Not yet. But the shift in energy was unmistakable. And just like that, the tone was set. Candace didn't blink. She had expected that kind of response, measured, layered, the kind of sentence that sounds like it belongs in a courtroom or a quote on Instagram. But she didn't come here to be outphrased. She leaned in, narrowing the space between them. You say survival, she countered. But isn't it convenient how your survival always seems to get airtime, applause, and awards? Some people are actually struggling, not monetizing it. Denzel's expression didn't change. He wasn't smiling anymore, but he wasn't offended either. Just listening, carefully. Like a man used to reading the room before he speaks. There's a difference, he said quietly, between telling your story and selling your story. I'm not on this show to sell anything. Candace raised her eyebrow. You're not? Then why are you here, Denzel? The way she said his name, sharp, with a touch of derision, caught the audience. Denzel didn't rise to it. He straightened in his seat just slightly and responded, his voice even. I'm here because I was invited. I'm here because silence isn't neutral. And I'm here because when people who've never had to explain their identity accuse others of weaponizing theirs, it says more about the accuser. The audience stirred. Not applause, not yet. Just a hum. Like tension cracking at the edges. Candace scoffed slightly. That's clever. But it's also evasive. I ask again, why do you keep showing up in political spaces when you're not a politician? Why should anyone care what you think? Denzel leaned forward for the first time. Because I'm an American, he said. Because I've raised children here, I've paid taxes here, I've lost friends to war, to poverty, to injustice, here. You think I need a title to care? That says everything. The host cut in quickly. Let's give both of you room. But the air was already thick. Candace replied sharply, and yet, every time someone disagrees with your version of truth, they're called blind or racist or worse. Where's the room for disagreement in your America? Denzel didn't hesitate. There's always room for disagreement, he said. Just not for denial. Disagree with my ideas, but don't erase my experience. This time, a few claps broke out in the back row. The host sat up straighter. And for the first time, Candace looked like she felt the audience slipping. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Candace adjusted her posture, briefly looked off camera, then back at Denzel. She wasn't unraveling, yet. But something in her rhythm had cracked. Her next line came out quicker than usual, a little sharper around the edges. I've lived through things too, Denzel. Don't act like pain is a monopoly you own. Denzel's eyes softened, not in pity, but in patience. He waited. Let the silence stretch again. It wasn't hesitation, it was control. And it made everyone in the studio wait with him. Then he said, I never said it was. But there's a difference between living through something and weaponizing the denial of someone else's story just to feel taller. Candace tensed. So now I'm what, a denier? An oppressor because I won't cry on cue? Denzel shook his head slowly. No. But you're performing strength by mocking pain. That's not toughness, it's avoidance dressed up as truth. That line landed hard. A few audience members gasped. The camera cut briefly to the host, whose frozen smile betrayed the internal panic of live television. Candace chuckled, but it was hollow now. You sure know how to play this room, she said. Hollywood taught you well. Denzel leaned forward slightly, his voice low and unshaken. No, life taught me. Hollywood only gave me a microphone. What I say into it? That's mine. Boom. Applause broke out, not overwhelming, but spontaneous. Candace opened her mouth to speak again, but the host raised a hand. Let's take a breath, he said. We'll be right back after the break. But the damage had already been done. The studio lights dimmed for commercial, but Denzel and Candace remained seated, silent, staring at each other. No words exchanged, just energy. And in that moment, the audience didn't need a script to know who had control of the stage. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a reckoning. As the studio lights dimmed for the commercial break, tension lingered like static in the air. Technicians moved quietly across the set, avoiding eye contact with the two guests. A makeup artist reached for Denzel, but he waved her off gently. He didn't need retouching, he wasn't playing a role. Candace tapped her fingers on the table, eyes forward, jaw tight. For a moment, the silence between them said more than their words had. It wasn't mutual respect. It was something colder, mutual awareness. Both knew they had entered a different arena now. When the lights came back on, so did the audience's attention. And something had changed. Denzel's posture hadn't moved, but now he seemed even more centered. Candace, however, was scanning the crowd more often, as if trying to read the room that was slowly slipping from her grasp. The host reintroduced the segment, his voice overly cheerful. Welcome back. We're here with actor and activist Denzel Washington and political commentator Candace Owens, discussing truth, pain, and America. Candace jumped in quickly, trying to regain ground. Let's stop pretending that just because someone speaks softly, they speak truth. Volume doesn't equal validity. Some of us choose facts over feelings. Denzel turned to her slowly. And some of us remember that facts without empathy become weapons. A quiet rippled from the audience. Not a cheer. Not a shout. Just the sound of people hearing something they'd felt but never quite put into words. Candace smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. So now I'm a weapon? You said that, Denzel replied calmly. I didn't. The host interjected, let's clarify, Candace, what are the facts you're referring to? She sat back, smug. That this country doesn't owe anyone a pat on the back for surviving hard things. Life is hard. Everyone struggles. Denzel nodded. That's true. But not everyone's struggle is criminalized. Not everyone's pain is politicized. And not everyone has to justify their humanity before they're allowed to speak. Silence. Even the host didn't speak. Candace opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Just a half-second delay. Enough for the audience to feel the shift again. And Denzel? He didn't gloat. He didn't grin. He just breathed, like a man who had already survived much worse than someone else's microphone. Candace leaned in now. Her voice sharpened, not louder, but edgier, aiming to draw blood with precision. You sit here as if you're some kind of moral compass, Denzel. But where was that energy when Chicago burned? When your community tore its own streets apart? Gasps flickered from the audience. The word community, said just so, was a dagger. Denzel didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch longer than television usually allows. Even the producers hesitated to cut in. Then, finally, his voice came, low, firm, and piercing. You're confusing pain with chaos. And assuming that survival without silence is savagery. Candace folded her arms. No, I'm calling out double standards. You speak when it's convenient. You show up when there's applause. But you weren't there when small businesses were burning. You weren't there when law enforcement was under siege. Denzel's expression shifted, not angry, not smug. Just deeply, unmistakably disappointed. I wasn't there for photo ops, he said. But I've sat in courtrooms with mothers who buried their sons. I've paid for funeral costs you'll never hear about. I don't do it for cameras. I do it because I've seen what happens when silence becomes strategy. The crowd didn't applaud. They were too locked in. Candace shook her head. You're still making it emotional. I deal in facts. Denzel turned fully now, locking eyes with her. The fact is, you've built a brand off denying other people's reality. You package skepticism as bravery. But it's just bitterness with a filter. That landed like a gut punch. The host raised his hand awkwardly. Okay. Let's try to reset. But it was too late. Candace was visibly rattled. Denzel? Still centered. Still calm. And the audience? They weren't watching a debate anymore. They were witnessing a reckoning. Candace crossed her legs, shifted in her chair, and let out a breath meant to sound dismissive, but it landed strained. The studio lights weren't just hot now, they were exposing. And not just her foundation. She smirked. You know, Denzel, you talk a lot about truth. But truth isn't always what feels good. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it offends. Denzel nodded slowly. That's true. But offending isn't the same as awakening. And what you call truth often sounds more like branding. Candace blinked. That word hit. Branding. The subtext wasn't lost on anyone. The host interjected gently, let's focus on solutions. What do both of you believe can move America forward? Candace sat up straighter. She seized the moment, her voice polished, rehearsed. We need to stop coddling people. We need to stop elevating emotional responses as if they're revolutionary. The country needs facts, discipline, and tough conversations. Denzel waited. Then leaned forward, elbows on the table. No one's asking to be coddled. But when people say, facts over feelings, they often mean, my comfort over your trauma. That's not toughness, that's cowardice wearing a suit. A murmur ran through the studio. Someone in the second row whispered, wow. Candace's face tightened. Cowardice? Denzel looked directly at her. Yes. It takes no courage to dismiss pain you've never felt. It takes no bravery to mock the fire when you've always stood in the rain. For the first time, Candace looked away. Not long. Just a second. But enough. She regrouped quickly. So now I'm a mocker? A denier of all human suffering? Denzel didn't raise his voice. You're a mirror for those who can't face themselves. And that's what makes you dangerous. The host sat back. Silence. And then, applause. Not just polite. Earnest. Candace forced a smile. Wow. You've got your audience. Denzel nodded once. No. I've got my integrity. The crowd erupted. She stared. He didn't blink. And for the first time, Candace Owens looked like she regretted accepting the invitation. As the applause faded, Candace tried to regain her footing. Her next line came with that familiar clipped confidence, but the rhythm was off. You keep making this about feelings. But leadership is about logic. It's about structure. And structure doesn't care how you feel, it works or it doesn't. Denzel smiled faintly. Not mockingly, just with the calm of someone who had seen this exact dance play out before. Structure, he echoed. That's a nice word. But let's not pretend it hasn't always worked better for some than others. Candace pressed forward, voice tightening. So what? Tear it all down? Burn the system to the ground because it hurt your feelings? And that's when Denzel leaned in, just enough. No, he said quietly. We expose it. We name it. We rewire it. Because I don't want it burned, I want it to serve everyone. Even those who still pretend it's fine as is. The host opened his mouth but hesitated. The conversation had passed the point of polite moderation. Candace snapped, You're acting like I don't care about people, like I don't want what's best for the country. Denzel replied, almost sadly, I think you do. But I think you've confused applause from the powerful with approval from the righteous. The audience gasped. It wasn't theatrical. It was instinct. Candace froze. I've stood in rooms full of billionaires, Denzel continued. And rooms full of people with nothing but dignity left. Only one of those rooms ever made me feel human. Candace looked visibly shaken. She opened her mouth to fire back, but the host raised his hand again. Let's take one final break, he said, his voice thinner now. We'll return to wrap up this powerful conversation. As the lights dimmed and crew scrambled behind the scenes, Candace stared straight ahead. Denzel? He reached for his water calmly. Took a sip. Didn't say a word. He didn't have to. When they returned from the break, the energy in the studio was strange, tight, compressed. You could feel the walls of the set straining to contain what had just taken place. No one was looking at the teleprompter anymore. The script was done. Candace Owens sat with a kind of stubborn stillness, chin slightly raised, eyes ahead, but not at Denzel. She wasn't backing down. But she wasn't in control anymore either. Denzel leaned forward, his fingers interlocked on the table. You know, he began, growing up, I watched leaders who didn't just win debates, they shifted how people felt about each other. That's what I miss. Not victory. Vision. Candace responded, but slower this time. You talk like truth is a feeling. That if it doesn't feel fair, it must be wrong. Denzel didn't blink. No. I talk like truth isn't scared of the light. If you say the system is perfect, you've never lived underneath it. There was a long pause. The host was clearly out of ways to soften this. So he didn't try. "Candace," he asked gently, "do you think you've ever dismissed pain that you didn't understand?" That stung. She didn't answer at first. "I think," she said finally, "that pain isn't a trump card. Just because something hurts doesn't make it policy." And Denzel leaned in again, just a little closer. "But ignoring pain has been policy in this country longer than either of us has been alive." It was quiet. A kind of raw honesty had filled the air that left no room for cleverness. Candace crossed her arms, face unreadable. Then the host asked his final question. "Denzel, if there's one thing you wish Americans would understand better, what is it?" Denzel took his time. "That listening isn't surrender," he said. "That we don't lose ground by hearing each other out. We gain humanity. And maybe, just maybe, we start fixing what's broken without burning down what's left." The show ended there. No grand send-off. No panel summary. Just silence. And then the phone started buzzing. The episode hadn't even finished airing before it started trending. A clip of Denzel's final line, "Listening isn't surrender," circulated faster than the official network feed. It was posted, reposted, clipped, stitched into reels with piano music, highlighted in bold white captions across black screens. Within the hour, Denzel was the #1 trending name on every platform. Not as an actor. Not even as a celebrity. As a voice. Candace Owens had her supporters, and they mobilized quickly. Her fans applauded her refusal to back down, calling her unshakable, tough, a fighter. But even within her usual circles, something was different. Some quietly admitted she'd been out-framed, not out-shouted. At CNN, a senior producer dropped his coffee when a tech whispered, "We need to reroute the 8 p.m. block." Meanwhile, Fox producers scrambled to spin it. "We'll cut just the bits where Candace stood her ground," someone said. "Clip out the rest. Don't let the empathy run too long." But it was already too late. The raw, unedited versions were everywhere. People weren't watching it to pick a side. They were watching to feel something different. In a downtown LA bar, the sound was off, but everyone was staring at a looped playback of Denzel at the table, still and powerful. In an Atlanta hospital break room, a nurse turned to a doctor and said, "I didn't expect to cry." It was just, calm. And true. Meanwhile, Denzel was in a black SUV, quiet, watching his phone light up non-stop. Ruben, his longtime press manager, was sitting beside him, grinning. "I told you. I told you this would land." Denzel shook his head. "I wasn't trying to land anything. I just didn't want to argue in a place where we're supposed to speak." Ruben turned serious. And that's why it worked. They pulled up to a community center where Denzel had agreed to speak before all this exploded. He walked through the side door, past a dozen organizers still setting up folding chairs. No stage. No spotlights. Just people. Local. Real. A teenager with a sketchpad stopped him. "Mr. Washington," he said, "my dad plays your video at the table now instead of Grace." Denzel laughed gently. "Tell him I didn't mean to replace prayer." The kid smiled. "You didn't. You reminded him what it sounds like." That moment, quiet, grounded, human, reflected exactly what the whole country had just felt. And in the back of the room, someone whispered, "He didn't raise his voice once," and still shook the whole nation. The community center event wasn't meant to be a headline. It was a local youth fundraiser, complete with folding chairs, lukewarm coffee, and a mic that crackled every third word. But tonight, it felt like the center of something bigger, because he was there. Denzel stepped up to the front, no teleprompter, no entourage, no production crew. Just him, a metal stand, and a room full of eyes that had seen what the world had seen, a man hold his ground without raising his voice. He looked across the faces, teens in hoodies, elders with walking sticks, a tired nurse still in scrubs. He took a breath. What happened on that stage, he began, wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about winning. It was about choosing not to let the loudest person in the room define what's true. The room was still. He continued, "We're told we have to yell to be heard. That calm is weakness. But if you can stay grounded when someone tries to pull you into their storm, that's power. And we all have that in us." He paused. Some folks asked why I didn't walk out. Why I didn't fire back harder. The truth is, I don't walk away from conversations that make people uncomfortable. That's where change lives. Right in the discomfort. A quiet clap started in the back. Then a few more. Not a standing ovation, just respect, rising in rhythm. He smiled. "I'm not interested in being a headline. I'm interested in being a mirror. If you saw yourself in what I said, good or bad, then maybe we're finally talking." Afterward, people lined up, not for selfies, but to say thank you. To share stories. A woman with gray braids handed him a note that simply read, "My grandson listened to you." That's a miracle. By midnight, the clip from the show had surpassed 40 million views. Not just in America. Global. But Denzel was asleep by then. Not checking numbers. Not watching reactions. Just resting, knowing that sometimes, the real revolution doesn't happen in noise. It happens when a man calmly refuses to bend, and the world finally listens. And in a world obsessed with shouting. He whispered. In a studio built for spectacle. He stood still. And in a moment where ego could have taken the stage. Denzel Washington chose something rarer, truth without theatrics. Candace Owens brought fire. Denzel answered with ice. But neither burned as hot as the silence he left behind. Because real strength doesn't need volume. It needs vision. And tonight, millions didn't just hear a debate. They witnessed a reminder. That calm is not weakness. That poise is not surrender. And sometimes, the loudest message is the one delivered in a whisper.